Hi, I'm Dr. Mohit Joshipura. I'm an internal medicine physician here in Dallas, and I'm a guest educator here at Doctors in Training. Let's get started with this warm-up review. First question. A gardener has shortness of breath, salivation, meiosis, and diarrhea. What is the most likely diagnosis, and what is the underlying mechanism? So this would be organophosphate poisoning from insecticides. What's the mechanism of action? This is one of those two-step questions. You need to know what caused the clinical presentation, and then you need to know what the mechanism of action of the substance is that caused it. Organophosphates are inhibitors of acetylcholinesterase. Organophosphates inhibit cholinesterase, which causes excess cholinergic stimulation of the muscarinic receptors. Next question. What is the mechanism of action of N-acetylcysteine when given as an antidote for acetaminophen or Tylenol overdose? So the answer here is that N-acetylcysteine regenerates glutathione. And next question. What is the equation for half-life? So you just derived this from your equation for clearance. Clearance equals 0.7 times the volume of distribution divided by the half-life. Then you do some algebra and you get half-life equals 0.7 times the volume of distribution divided by the clearance. Alright, that's it for this warm-up review. Let's move on to the lecture.
Hello everyone and welcome to our Step 1 video on electrophysiology. This subject always reminds me of my first day of surgery as a third-year medical student. I had this patient that was suffering from a terrible wound dehiscence in her belly. She had this kind of big abdominal wound that kind of broke open after the surgery, and it was all juicy and smelly. It was gross. So she was in the ICU, and anytime a nurse or a doctor would comment on kind of how she was doing, maybe she was a little tachycardic, she'd start screaming, "Oh my God, I'm tachycardic! Somebody save me!" She would also sing Beach Boy songs. It was hilarious. So that was my first exposure to ICU psychosis. She was kind of off her nut. And then one day she looked at me and she said, "You have perfect hair. May I touch it?" I said, "No, crazy ICU lady, you can't touch my hair." But it was at that moment that I realized she wasn't psychotic at all. She just really liked hair. All right, so we're moving on this lecture, and this lecture is going to deal with electrophysiology. Now, specifically, we'll be looking at myocytes and how different types of myocytes create different action potentials. Now, first we'll cover ventricular action potentials, and then we'll cover the pacemaker cells and their action potentials as well. So this can be a bit intimidating at first because we're dealing with potassium and calcium and membrane potentials, but all that'll be pretty easy by the end of this video. All right, so let's talk about some heart physiology. So in order for the heart to pump, there needs to be an organized and well-timed electrical signal that travels through the heart. And along with that signal, you need to have muscle cells that can contract repeatedly. Now, normally, the sinoatrial node, the SA node, is the pacemaker because it exhibits something called automaticity. And we'll go over that in just a minute. Therefore, it undergoes regular depolarizations and it's going to create action potentials. And before we get too far down the rabbit hole, what is an action potential? Well, an action potential is a short-lasting event where the electrical membrane potential of a cell rapidly rises and then falls. So this electrical signal then propagates down the conduction pathway in the atria until it reaches the AV node. And from there, the signal is propagated to the distal end of the ventricles, and then the rest of the ventricular tissue is signaled. So what is the result of all this? Well, all this is designed to allow the atria to contract before the ventricles. So the electrical signal from the SA node moves through the atria, causing that atrial contraction. And there's enough delay in that signal that blood has enough time to move from the atria to the ventricle, and then finally that electrical signal produces a nice ventricular contraction. And all that blood that was delivered by the atria is then pumped either to the body or to the lungs. So now we need to look more closely at the actual myocytes and how these cells are able to either propagate or create action potentials. All right, so let's cover our ventricular action potential. Now, I actually think it's a little confusing to try to memorize all the different types of action potentials. Now, if you look at the action potentials for the atria, for the ventricles, for the bundle of His, they all actually look pretty similar. Small differences, but pretty similar. So I actually group all these together and just cover a typical myocyte action potential, but others will refer to it as a ventricular action potential, but the same thing. Now, the SA and the AV nodes are pretty similar as well, and we're going to group those two together. But first, let's master that regular ventricular myocyte action potential. Now, there are 4 phases to the action potential of a myocyte. The key to understanding the action potential is knowing what the membrane of the myocyte is permeable to. If the membrane is permeable to potassium and nothing else, then the membrane potential will want to stay somewhere between -75 and -95 millivolts. So potassium tends to leave the inside of a cell through potassium channels, and this causes a very negative electrochemical gradient. Now, if the cell is permeable to only sodium, then the membrane potential will want to jump up to about +50 millivolts. Now, sodium tends to enter cells, and that's why we see a positive gradient. Calcium, similarly, if you have calcium permeability, will also want to keep the membrane potential positive, again, at about +20, so not quite as much as sodium. So again, the key to understanding why an action potential is occurring is based on what the cell is permeable to. So just to recap, potassium is -75 to maybe -95, sodium is a +50, and calcium is a +20. All right, so let's look at this picture. Now, I like to start looking at phase 4 first, and I know that seems a little bit out of order, but phase 4 is considered the resting potential. So to me, this is the baseline status of the ventricular myocyte. And now it's at about -75, maybe -85 millivolts, and nothing interesting is happening. It's pretty flat. So what would you think the membrane is permeable to at this phase? Well, it's obviously potassium. So potassium can move back and forth through those potassium channels, mostly out, and the membrane is low at about that -75. Now move to the left side of the picture. So we're kind of starting over here. And here you see a vertical line that is referred to as phase 0. So you can imagine a cell hanging out in phase 4, the resting potential, and then this phase 0 occurs rather abruptly. So what's changed? Well, at phase 0, the voltage-gated sodium channels open, and thus it's going to increase the sodium permeability. Now it's going to drive up and depolarize the cell up towards that +55 direction that we talked about before. Now you notice that we don't get all the way up to +55 because there's still potassium permeability going on, and we're starting from such a negative resting potential. So connect in your mind, phase 0 equals increasing sodium permeability. Phase 1, you go back down a little bit in our gradient here. So this is what we call the initial repolarization. Here we see inactivation of those sodium channels. So the same sodium channels that brought that potential up, depolarized the cell, is now, those are all closing, and the potential starts to come back down. And the other thing that's happening is the voltage-gated potassium channels are now beginning to open as well. So less permeability to sodium is going to prevent it from staying high. Increased permeability to potassium is going to start causing it to go back down, and you have that initial repolarization. Next is phase 2. So what's happening at phase 2? Well, this is referred to as the plateau phase. Now the potential goes up just a little bit, or at least flattens out for a bit. So here you have voltage-gated calcium channels opening. And again, this is going to drive that membrane potential towards around +20. So it's going upwards. It balances out that potassium effect that we saw just before this. And then this is what triggers calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and also causes myocyte contraction. So let me say this again. So in phase 2, that's where you're going to see myocyte contraction. Now let's move on to phase 3. Phase 3 is rapid repolarization. So what would you think is happening here? Well, you have more permeability to potassium again, and you also start to close all those calcium channels that we saw in the previous phase. Now the same calcium channels that were maintaining the plateau in phase 2 are now, they're going out of service here. They're starting to close. And so the potassium is becoming more and more relevant. It's decreasing that slope rather dramatically, and then we end up back at the resting potential in phase 4, and then the pattern just begins all over again. Now the other thing that you should know is that between phase 0 and towards the end of phase 3, this is what we call the effective refractory period. And during your effective refractory period, you cannot elicit another phase 0 depolarization. And this is a very critical element, a very critical piece of the puzzle, because something that will increase the effective refractory period will make it so that you can't depolarize very quickly. You can't go through another phase 0 quickly, and that's going to slow the heart down. So if you want to slow the heart down with an antiarrhythmic, you increase your effective refractory period. So when we go through the antiarrhythmic drugs later, then you'll already know why these medicines are working. Okay, so let's go to the pacemaker action potential. So not everything in your heart is just a mindless muscle cell. You have pacemaker cells like the SA node and the AV node. So what's the difference between a pacemaker action potential and a ventricular action potential? Well, if you look at their graphs, you notice that there's no phase 1 or phase 2 with the pacemaker cells. So no phase 1, no phase 2. So what's happening here? This is kind of weird. Well, let's start with phase 4 again, which is again your quote-unquote resting membrane potential. But it's not really resting, is it? It appears to have a slope. And phase 4 is down here somewhere between, again, minus 60, maybe minus 80. It's not that important to know the exact number. Again, freely permeable to what, again? It's going to be potassium. Now, potassium is just freely leaving that cell, and the gradient is, again, pretty negative. But again, you should notice that there's a gradual increase in the slope during phase 4. So what is causing this gradual increase in phase 4? Well, the membrane potential is spontaneously depolarizing as sodium conductance increases. So you have sodium channels that are gradually opening one by one and increasing the membrane potential of those SA and AV nodes. And then a threshold is reached. And when that particular threshold is reached, that causes the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. And when that occurs, we call it, again, the phase 0. So your phase 0 of your pacemaker cells is not due to sodium, like we saw with our regular myocytes. Phase 0 here is due to calcium influx. So let me repeat that. Phase 0 in a pacemaker cell is due to calcium influx. Again, what caused phase 0 in that regular myocyte? It was sodium. But now in the pacemaker cells, it's going to be calcium. That's going to cause the dramatic depolarization. Now, what was calcium doing in that regular myocyte? Well, remember, it was causing that plateau phase in phase 2. But you'll notice that in the pacemaker cell, we don't even have a phase 2 or a plateau. So when we start talking about antiarrhythmics again, what might work on a pacemaker cell? Which do you think would inhibit that phase 0 again? Well, it's going to be the calcium channel blockers, right? So you need to know what ion contributes to phase 0, and that calcium channel blocker would inhibit that step. Also, we're moving on. There's no phase 2, but we still have a phase 3, which is the inactivation of the calcium channels, which will allow the gradient to drop again. And we also see in phase 3 an increase in potassium permeability again, which is again going to eventually lead us back down to our phase 4 baseline, and we start the entire process over again. So fewer steps in this pacemaker look at here. So to wrap this section up, the big differences here is that our phase 4 is not a resting potential. With a gradual increase in sodium permeability, the membrane potential is always increasing. This is what leads to that automaticity of the SA node and the AV node. And then it's calcium influx that leads to the big depolarization. All right, that brings us to the end of the video part. It's time for that end of session quiz. Try to answer all those questions on your own, and then we'll go through them together. First question, diagram the phases of a myocardial action potential and describe which ion channels are responsible for each phase. So we're going to basically do this all over again to really get it into your brains. So first we have phase 0. What was that? Rapid depolarization, which is due to the opening of sodium channels. And then the phase 1 is early repolarization, where these sodium channels are going to close and the voltage-gated potassium channels begin to open. And then you have phase 2, which is that plateau phase. What was that due to? Voltage-gated calcium channels. Phase 3 is the repolarization due to opening of slow potassium channels. And then phase 4 is your baseline membrane potential, which is mainly due to just potassium permeability. Next, describe the flow of ions during a pacemaker action potential. Let's go through it again. So let's start at 4 this time. Phase 4, which is your baseline membrane potential. And in your pacemaker cells, there's a slow increase in your sodium conductance, which causes that slow increase in the slope of phase 4. And then you reach a threshold and you depolarize, which is that phase 0, and its influx of calcium, which is causing that depolarization. There's no plateau. And then phase 3 is the repolarization back down to baseline, which is due to potassium permeability. All right, next question. What physiology accounts for the automaticity of the AV and the SA nodes? You should know by now, we've talked about it a bunch. It's primarily that phase 4 gradual sodium conductance, the fact that during phase 4 that membrane becomes more and more slowly permeable to sodium. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of our video. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.